There are smiles that hide everything. The kind that say everything is fine when nothing really is. Emma noticed it first on a Tuesday morning, watching her mother pour coffee with that same practiced expression she had worn for years. But this time, something felt different. Something felt wrong. What started as a daughter's intuition turned into a journey through the hidden psychology of maternal burnout, the silent epidemic affecting millions of mothers who smile through exhaustion, anxiety, and complete emotional depletion. This is not just a story about one family. This is about the invisible weight mothers carry, the masks they wear, and what happens when someone finally sees through them. What Emma discovered changed everything she thought she knew about her mother, about sacrifice, and about the devastating cost of staying silent. Emma had seen her mother smile 1,000 times, but that Tuesday morning felt different. The corners of Claire's mouth lifted in the same practiced way they always did. Her eyes crinkled at the edges, and her voice carried the usual cheerful tone as she poured coffee into 3 mugs. But something was off. Claire moved through the kitchen with mechanical precision, setting out breakfast plates, checking backpacks, signing permission slips, all while maintaining that same fixed expression. The house was loud that morning. Emma's younger brother Jake was complaining about his math homework. Her father David was rushing to find his car keys, and the television hummed with morning news in the background. Claire orchestrated it all without missing a beat. Her responses automatic, her movements efficient. She reminded Jake about his soccer practice, handed David his briefcase, and kissed both of them goodbye without ever letting that smile falter. But when the door finally closed and the house fell silent, Emma watched from the hallway as her mother stood motionless at the kitchen sink, staring at nothing. Claire didn't move for almost 2 minutes. Her hands gripped the counter edge, knuckles white, shoulders rigid. The smile had vanished the moment she thought no one was watching, replaced by an expression Emma had never seen before. It wasn't sadness exactly, or anger, or even exhaustion, though all 3 seemed present somehow. It was emptiness, a complete absence of anything behind her eyes, as if the person who had just served breakfast and kissed everyone goodbye had simply disappeared, leaving only a shell standing in her place. Eva felt her stomach tighten. She had noticed small things over the past few months, subtle changes she had dismissed as stress or tiredness. Her mother forgetting appointments she never used to miss. The way Claire would start sentences and trail off mid-thought, her mind clearly elsewhere. How she had stopped talking about her own day, her own feelings, her own life, beyond the endless cycle of meals, laundry, school runs, and managing everyone else's schedules. But this was different. This felt like watching someone drowning in plain sight while pretending everything was fine. The psychological term for what Claire was experiencing had a clinical name, though she would never use it herself. Maternal burnout. A state of complete physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by the relentless demands of motherhood without adequate support, rest, or personal fulfillment. It manifested in chronic fatigue, emotional detachment, loss of pleasure in parenting, and a profound sense of being overwhelmed by responsibilities that never ended. Unlike regular stress or temporary exhaustion, burnout represented a fundamental shift in how a person functioned. A depletion so deep that even basic tasks felt insurmountable. Claire had been a vibrant person once. Emma remembered her mother laughing freely, pursuing hobbies, meeting friends for coffee, talking about books she had read or movies she wanted to see. But over the years, those parts of her had been systematically erased, replaced by an endless list of tasks and responsibilities. Wake up early, pack lunches, drive carpool, manage homework, cook dinner, clean kitchen, help with projects, attend meetings, coordinate schedules, handle emergencies, soothe feelings, resolve conflicts, and do it all again tomorrow. Every single day, without breaks, without acknowledgement, without anyone noticing the toll it was taking. The invisible labor of motherhood had consumed her completely. Society expected women to manage households, raise children, maintain relationships, and often work outside the home, all while making it look effortless. The pressure to be everything to everyone, to never complain, to always put others first, had become toxic. Claire had internalized these expectations so deeply that she felt guilty even thinking about her own needs. She believed that admitting struggle meant admitting failure, that asking for help meant she wasn't good enough, that feeling exhausted meant she didn't love her family properly. Emma started paying closer attention after that morning. She noticed how her mother's hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking, how she would sit in her car for 10 minutes after grocery shopping before coming inside, as if gathering strength to face the house again. How her responses had become shorter, more clipped, as if forming complete sentences required energy she no longer possessed. Claire had stopped eating proper meals, grabbing bites of whatever was left on other people's plates, but never sitting down for herself. Her clothes hung looser, her face looked drawn, and dark circles had taken permanent residence under her eyes. The family dynamics had shifted without anyone acknowledging it. David assumed Claire had everything under control, because she always had before. He worked long hours and came home expecting dinner ready, the house clean, and problems already solved. He wasn't deliberately neglectful, just oblivious to the constant mental and emotional labor his wife performed. Jake was absorbed in his own teenage world, taking for granted that his mother would always be there to drive him places, buy what he needed, and solve whatever issues arose. Nobody asked Claire how she was feeling. Nobody noticed she had stopped talking about herself entirely. Emma began researching online late at night, typing searches about maternal exhaustion, depression in mothers, and emotional burnout. The articles she found described her mother with devastating accuracy. The chronic fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. The emotional numbness that made even joyful moments feel flat. The sense of being trapped in a role with no escape. The guilt that accompanied every small moment of resentment. The isolation of feeling like nobody understood or cared about the invisible work being done constantly. The fear that admitting struggle would be seen as weakness or lack of love. One article explained that maternal burnout often went unrecognized because mothers were expected to be selfless, tireless, and endlessly patient. When they struggled, they were told to try harder, be more organized, practice more self-care. As if a bubble bath could fix systemic problems of inadequate support and impossible expectations. The reality was that burnout resulted from prolonged stress without relief, from giving constantly without receiving, from being needed by everyone while feeling valued by no one. It wasn't a personal failing. It was a predictable outcome of unsustainable demands. Emma decided to talk to her mother on a Saturday afternoon when the house was unusually quiet. She found Claire folding laundry in the bedroom, moving mechanically through an endless pile of clothes. Emma sat on the bed and asked gently if her mother was okay. Claire's automatic response came immediately. That same practiced smile, the reassuring words that everything was fine. But when Emma pressed further, when she said she had noticed things and was worried, Claire's facade finally cracked. Her hands stilled on a half-folded shirt. Her eyes filled with tears. She clearly hadn't allowed herself to cry in a long time. What came next was not a conversation Emma had been prepared for. Her mother's words tumbled out in broken fragments, years of suppressed feelings suddenly finding voice. Claire talked about feeling invisible, like she only mattered for what she could do for others, not for who she actually was. She described waking up every morning with dread, facing another day of endless tasks that nobody noticed or appreciated unless they weren't done. She admitted feeling resentful, then guilty for feeling resentful, then more exhausted from managing those conflicting emotions. She confessed that some days she fantasized about just disappearing, Not dying, but simply ceasing to exist in this role that had consumed her identity completely. The conversation that afternoon changed something fundamental between Emma and her mother, though the relief Claire felt was temporary. Saying the truth out loud didn't fix the underlying problems. The demands of daily life continued unchanged, and within days, Claire had slipped back into her automatic patterns, smiling through exhaustion, managing everyone's needs while ignoring her own. But Emma couldn't unsee what she had learned. She began noticing details throughout the house that told stories of invisible labor and unacknowledged sacrifice. The refrigerator whiteboard was covered in everyone else's schedules, but contained nothing about Claire's own activities, because she no longer had any. The family calendar showed doctor appointments, school events, work meetings, and social plans for everyone except her. Closet shelves held neatly organized bins labeled with everyone's names and seasonal clothes, maintained by someone who clearly hadn't bought anything new for herself in years. The bathroom counter held skincare products Claire used to enjoy, but now sat dusty and neglected, while everyone else's supplies were always stocked and ready. Emma started conversations with her father that were harder than she had anticipated. David genuinely didn't understand the problem at first. He pointed out that he worked full-time to support the family, that Claire had chosen to stay home, that he helped when asked. But Emma challenged those assumptions carefully. She asked him to list everything Claire did in a typical day, then a typical week. As David tried to enumerate the tasks, his expression slowly changed. He had never actually thought about the scope of work involved in managing a household and 2 children. He had simply assumed it happened naturally, without effort or planning. The statistics Emma found were staggering. Research showed that mothers spent significantly more time on childcare and household tasks than fathers, even in households where both parents worked outside the home. The mental load of remembering appointments, anticipating needs, planning ahead, and managing family logistics fell disproportionately on women. This invisible labor was exhausting precisely because it never ended and was rarely recognized. Society had normalized the expectation that mothers would sacrifice their own well-being for their families without complaint or support. Claire's burnout had physical manifestations beyond exhaustion. She had developed frequent headaches, digestive issues, and muscle tension that no amount of rest seemed to relieve. Her immune system had weakened, making her susceptible to every illness that circulated through the family. Sleep had become shallow and non-restorative, her mind racing through tomorrow's tasks, even when her body desperately needed rest. These weren't separate problems, but symptoms of a nervous system chronically activated by stress, with no opportunity to recover. The emotional toll was even more devastating. Claire described feeling disconnected from her own emotions, as if she were watching her life from outside herself. Activities that used to bring joy now felt like obligations. She struggled to feel present, even in moments that should have been meaningful. Her mind always occupied with the next task, the next responsibility, the next person needing something. The guilt about feeling this way was crushing. She loved her family but felt trapped by them. She wanted to be a good mother but felt like she was failing constantly. Emma learned that maternal burnout was distinct from postpartum depression, though they shared some symptoms. Burnout developed gradually over time, the result of sustained stress and depletion without adequate recovery. It wasn't caused by hormonal changes, but by environmental factors, by a system that demanded everything from mothers while providing minimal support. Recovery required not just individual self-care, but structural changes in how families functioned and how labor was distributed. One person could not fix burnout alone when the underlying dynamics remained unchanged. The family meeting Emma orchestrated was uncomfortable for everyone. Jake initially resisted the idea that he needed to do more, arguing that he was busy with school and activities. David became defensive when confronted with how little he actually knew about the daily operation of their household. But Emma persisted, laying out specific examples and asking direct questions. Who kept track of when Jake needed new shoes? Who noticed when household supplies were running low? Who remembered extended family birthdays? Who managed medical appointments? Who planned meals? Who handled school communications? The answers were always the same. Claire. Everything fell on Claire, and when she struggled or forgot something, she was the one who felt guilty and inadequate. Nobody else felt responsible because they had never been asked to be. The family had collectively created a dynamic where one person carried the entire mental and emotional load, while others benefited, without recognizing the cost. This wasn't intentional cruelty, but rather the result of socialized patterns and unchallenged assumptions about gender roles and parental responsibilities. Changes came slowly and with resistance. David started doing his own laundry and learned to cook several meals he could prepare without Claire's help. Jake took on responsibility for managing his own schedule and keeping track of his belongings. Emma created shared digital calendars and task lists so the mental load of remembering everything didn't fall solely on her mother. But habits formed over years don't disappear overnight, and Claire herself struggled to let go of control, feeling guilty when things weren't done her way, or anxious when she wasn't managing every detail. The deeper issue was Claire's identity. She had defined herself almost entirely through her role as wife and mother for so long that she didn't know who she was outside those contexts. When asked what she enjoyed, what she wanted, what made her happy, she struggled to answer. Those parts of herself had been so thoroughly suppressed that accessing them felt impossible. Recovery wasn't just about reducing tasks, but about rebuilding a sense of self that had been erased by years of putting everyone else first. Emma suggested therapy, but Claire initially refused, insisting she wasn't depressed and didn't need professional help. She saw asking for support as weakness, another failure in her long list of inadequacies. Emma persisted gently, explaining that burnout was a legitimate psychological condition with documented treatments, not a personal flaw or moral failing. Eventually, Claire agreed to see someone, choosing a therapist who specialized in women's mental health and maternal burnout specifically. Therapy sessions revealed layers of internalized beliefs Claire hadn't recognized she carried. She believed her worth depended on how well she served others. She thought expressing needs was selfish. She felt responsible for everyone's emotions and well-being. She had learned from her own mother and society that good women sacrificed endlessly without complaint. These beliefs had shaped her choices for decades, creating a pattern that eventually led to complete depletion. Challenging them felt dangerous, like dismantling the foundation of her entire identity. The turning point came during a session when Claire's therapist asked her what she would tell a friend experiencing the same situation. Would she tell that friend she was weak? That she should try harder? That her exhaustion was her own fault? Claire realized she would never say those things to someone she cared about. Yet she told them to herself constantly. The double standard was glaring. She extended compassion and understanding to everyone except herself, holding herself to impossible standards while making excuses for others. Recovery was not linear. There were days when Claire felt hopeful and engaged, followed by days when the old patterns pulled her back into numbness and exhaustion. The family's commitment to change wavered when it required consistent effort and sacrifice of their own comfort. David sometimes forgot his new responsibilities. Jake occasionally reverted to expecting his mother to solve his problems. And Emma struggled with her own guilt about not noticing her mother's suffering sooner. Progress happened in small increments, with setbacks and frustrations along the way. What sustained the process was Claire slowly rediscovering parts of herself she thought were lost forever. She started reading again, joining a book club that met monthly and gave her something to look forward to. She reconnected with an old friend who understood the complexities of motherhood without judgment. She began setting boundaries, saying no to requests that depleted her, and allowing herself time alone without feeling guilty. These weren't dramatic changes, but small reclamations of autonomy and personhood that accumulated over time. Emma watched her mother's transformation with relief and sadness. Relief that Claire was healing, sadness about how much suffering could have been prevented with earlier awareness and support. The experience changed Emma's understanding of motherhood, family dynamics, and the invisible labor that sustained households. She became vocal among her peers about recognizing burnout in mothers, challenging assumptions about parental roles, and advocating for systemic support rather than individual responsibility. She knew her mother's story wasn't unique, but representative of millions of women struggling in silence. The smile that had first alerted Emma to her mother's suffering eventually changed. It became genuine again, though different than before. Claire smiled less automatically, but more authentically. She allowed herself to feel and express the full range of emotions, including frustration, sadness, and anger when appropriate. The mask she had worn for so long was gone, replaced by a more honest, if more complicated, expression of who she actually was. That honesty, Emma realized, was worth far more than the comfortable illusion of effortless perfection they had all believed in before. The months following Claire's first therapy session revealed how deeply rooted her patterns had become, and how resistant systems were to change. Recovery was not a smooth upward trajectory, but a series of advances and retreats. Moments of clarity, followed by backsliding into old habits. Claire found herself fighting not just her own internalized beliefs, but also the expectations of everyone around her who had grown comfortable with the version of herself she had constructed. When she started saying no to requests that exceeded her capacity, family members responded with confusion and sometimes resentment, as if her boundaries were personal attacks rather than necessary self-preservation. David struggled more than anyone to adjust to the new dynamics. He intellectually understood the problem after Emma's interventions and their family discussions, but emotional understanding came much slower. He would still occasionally ask Claire where his specific shirt was or what they were having for dinner, as if these were her natural responsibilities rather than shared household concerns. Each time Claire redirected him to solve his own problems, tension simmered. He felt criticized and defensive, interpreting her boundaries as rejection. She felt exhausted by having to explain repeatedly why she could no longer function as the household manager for every detail of everyone else's lives. The guilt Claire experienced when prioritizing herself was almost unbearable at first. Years of conditioning had taught her that good mothers were selfless, that her worth was measured by her availability and service to others. When she joined the book club and spent 2 hours every month reading and discussing literature with other women, she felt nauseating anxiety about what wasn't getting done at home during that time. Her therapist worked with her on challenging these automatic thoughts, asking her to examine the evidence that spending 2 hours monthly on personal enrichment made her a bad mother or damaged her family in any measurable way. Research on maternal burnout recovery indicated that rebuilding identity outside of caregiving roles was crucial but difficult. Women who had spent years defining themselves solely through relationships to others, as someone's wife or someone's mother, often experienced profound disorientation when trying to reconnect with personal interests, goals, and desires. The process required not just time, but active practice in listening to one's own needs, which had been systematically suppressed. Many women reported feeling selfish or guilty when engaging in activities purely for personal enjoyment, a response rooted in socialized gender expectations about female sacrifice. Claire's physical symptoms began improving slowly. The chronic headaches became less frequent as her stress levels decreased. She started sleeping more deeply once she implemented boundaries around evening tasks and stopped staying up late to complete endless household chores. Her appetite returned, and she began eating actual meals rather than leftover scraps from other people's plates. The tension in her shoulders loosened as she practiced saying no and allowing tasks to remain undone if they fell outside her reduced responsibilities. Her body had been sending distress signals for years that she had learned to ignore, and now she was finally learning to listen. The relationship between Emma and her mother shifted into something more honest and complex. Emma saw Claire not just as a parent, but as a full person with struggles, limitations, and needs. This new perspective was both enlightening and unsettling. Emma realized how much she had taken for granted, how many invisible tasks her mother had performed that made everyone else's lives easier. She noticed mothers everywhere now, recognizing the exhaustion behind practiced smiles, the way women automatically manage social dynamics and anticipated needs while receiving little recognition or support. It changed how Emma thought about gender, family, and her own future. Jake's adjustment was perhaps the most dramatic. At 15, he had been the most resistant to changes in household dynamics, accustomed to having his mother solve problems and manage his life. When Claire stopped doing his laundry and refused to drive him places without advance notice, he was angry and resentful. He complained that she was being mean, that she didn't care about him anymore. These accusations cut deeply, triggering Claire's guilt and making her want to retreat into old patterns. But her therapist helped her understand that teaching Jake self-sufficiency and respect for her time was actually better parenting than doing everything for him. The turning point with Jake came unexpectedly. Claire had a severe migraine one Saturday and stayed in bed most of the day, something she would never have allowed herself to do before. Jake, realizing his mother was genuinely unwell, made her tea without being asked and brought it upstairs with toast. The gesture was small but significant, demonstrating that he was capable of noticing someone else's needs and responding with care. Claire cried when he left the room, moved by this evidence that her son could extend the same consideration to her that she had always shown him. It suggested that change was possible, that new patterns could replace old ones. Claire's therapist introduced the concept of the mental load, explaining how the invisible cognitive work of managing a household was as exhausting as physical tasks, and often more so because it never ended. Remembering appointment schedules, anticipating needs, planning meals, tracking inventory of household supplies, managing social obligations, coordinating family schedules. These tasks required constant mental engagement and generated persistent low-level stress. Research showed that this cognitive labor fell disproportionately on women, even in households where physical tasks were more equally distributed, because the planning and management remained invisible and therefore unrecognized. To address this, Emma helped create shared digital systems where everyone was responsible for inputting their own schedules, needs, and commitments. The family adopted a meal planning rotation where each person was responsible for one dinner per week, including shopping for ingredients and cooking. David took ownership of household maintenance tasks and created his own tracking system for things like changing air filters and scheduling service appointments. These changes didn't happen smoothly. There were forgotten responsibilities, complaints about the new systems, and moments when it seemed easier to revert to old patterns. But Claire held firm, refusing to step back into the role of household manager for everyone else's lives. The book club became unexpectedly important to Claire's recovery. The women in the group ranged in age and life circumstances, but many shared similar experiences with invisible labor, identity loss, and the exhaustion of constant caregiving without support. Conversations that began about the book they had read inevitably drifted into discussions about their lives, their frustrations, their struggles to maintain any sense of self outside their roles as mothers and wives. These discussions normalized Claire's experiences and helped her understand that her burnout wasn't a personal failure, but a predictable response to systemic problems affecting millions of women. One member of the book club, a woman named Patricia, had experienced burnout so severe she had left her family for 3 months, checking into an extended stay hotel to force her husband and adult children to function without her constant management. The story shocked Claire initially, but Patricia explained that it had been necessary for her survival and had ultimately saved her marriage and her relationship with her children. They had been forced to recognize how much they had taken from her without reciprocating, how they had treated her as a resource to be consumed rather than a person with needs and limits. The separation had reset their dynamics entirely. Claire wasn't ready for such a dramatic intervention, but hearing Patricia's story expanded her understanding of what recovery could look like and how serious the consequences of untreated burnout could become. It reinforced that prioritizing her own well-being wasn't selfish, but necessary, not just for herself, but for her family's long-term health. Children who watched mothers sacrifice themselves completely learned problematic lessons about gender roles, self-worth, and relationships. Breaking the pattern was difficult but important, not just for Claire, but for the next generation. The financial dimension of Claire's situation became clearer during therapy. She had stopped working outside the home when Jake was born, a decision that made sense at the time, given childcare costs and David's career demands. But 15 years later, she had no recent work experience, no retirement savings in her own name, and complete financial dependence on her husband. This dependence had contributed to her inability to advocate for herself, creating a power imbalance where David's needs and preferences took priority because he was the breadwinner. Claire's therapist encouraged her to consider what financial independence might look like and whether returning to work was something she wanted. The idea of working outside the home again felt both exciting and terrifying. Claire had been a graphic designer before having children, but 15 years away from the field meant her skills were outdated and her portfolio was irrelevant. She would essentially be starting over, competing with younger workers who had maintained their careers without interruption. The prospect was daunting, but it also represented possibility, a chance to rebuild an identity and purpose beyond her family. She started taking online courses to update her skills. If potential changes to that arrangement, counseling helped them navigate these tensions and recognize the underlying assumptions and power dynamics they needed to address. Emma watched these dynamics with growing awareness of how they might affect her own future. She was approaching college age and thinking about career paths, relationships, and what kind of life she wanted to build. Her mother's experience had taught her that the choices women made early in relationships and family formation had long-term consequences that weren't always obvious at the time. Emma became determined not to replicate patterns she had witnessed, to establish equality and shared responsibility from the beginning of any serious relationship, rather than allowing imbalances to develop gradually and become entrenched over time. The transformation in Claire's emotional state became increasingly visible. She laughed more genuinely and more often. Her eyes had lost the haunted, exhausted look that Emma had first noticed that Tuesday morning. She talked about things beyond logistics and schedules, sharing thoughts about books she had read, ideas she found interesting, and plans for her own future. The woman who had disappeared beneath years of caregiving and self-negation was slowly re-emerging, not unchanged by her experiences, but no longer consumed by them. Recovery wasn't returning to who she had been before, but becoming someone new, someone who had survived depletion and was rebuilding with greater awareness and stronger boundaries.